Hey guys, just a quick lecture this week about the genre of the slave narrative. So last week you read Equiano, and then this week you're reading an excerpt from Harriet Jacobs. And you're probably already familiar with Frederick Douglass's narrative, which I wish that we had time to read the whole thing in this week's class, but we don't. So we're going to look at a speech from him instead. But I wanted to give you some context about the genre itself of the slave narrative, because it's something that seems kind of self-evident, right? It's a testimony of an experience, not the experience, because right, there's no one single story, but an experience of enslavement. But there's sort of a longer history behind it. So the slave narrative is usually abolitionist driven, meaning they've been written in order to appeal to abolitionists in order to abolish slavery, usually intending to elicit sympathy by drawing on Christian ethics and morality. They've been written for white audiences and readerships, and the genre itself fuses a bunch of intertextual influences. So we have a combination of spiritual autobiography, captivity narrative, the 18th century British novel that focuses on virtue and sentiment, and then a 19th century American domesticity novel. So what these authors were doing were taking pieces of all of these existing genres that were circulating at the time and kind of combining them to form sort of a new genre that emerged. And scholarship, in terms of historical and literary scholarship, has been split. Are these autobiographies? Are they literary? How do we measure the authenticity of who wrote it and how accurate it is? Or to what extent does that even matter? What happens if we read them as a historical text? What happens if we read them as a novel? What do we get from them? So by the 19th century, slave narratives started to adhere to a sort of similar literary structure, and Frederick Douglass's narrative sort of shaped this and kind of changed it and kind of set the standard for other slave narratives going forward. So some scholars have argued that the slave narrative is the only truly American contribution to literature. I find that problematic for a number of reasons, one of which we already discussed last week, and that's that there are slave narratives that come from the Atlantic, that come from the Caribbean, that might not look like Frederick Douglass's or Harriet Jacobs, but they're still showing and describing the experience of an enslaved person, even if it was, taken down orally, or if it was had multiple authors, or if it was kind of passed down in oral tradition or ballad form. So they can look different, but there are slave narratives that exist outside of the U.S., certainly. So moving up the timeline a little bit, in the 1930s, the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration, which came out of the New Deal in order to employ people, they hired people that were employed by the government in order to collect stories, and many of these stories were experiences of former slaves. So a bunch of these stories began to emerge then. But most of these were actually out of print until about 1969. So these weren't narratives that were always studied. Sometimes they were considered as propaganda. Sometimes the argument about their authenticity was challenged so much that scholars and students didn't study them as historical or literary texts. But what we can really see is that these are bottom-up history that are telling a lot of individual stories. These weren't really considered literary texts, like something that you would read in a class like this, until about 1979, 1985, when scholars like Henry Louis Gates, who you read the first week, began arguing for their scholarly merits. So I'm going to run through some common motifs of slave narratives, because if you start to read a lot, you'll notice that there are things that occur over and over again. Again, this sort of pastiche of a bunch of different genres. So we usually see the sort of general descent from innocence to the horror of chattel slavery, and then a progression up towards freedom. It often opens with an articulation of the familial and geographical genealogy. So something like, I was born in ... or my parents were, or my mother was, or this was my name. Then we see this sort of innocent childhood when they didn't realize that they were a slave, and then that entrance into the blood-stained gate, which we talked about in the forums last week, and this progressive dehumanization. There's often an emphasis on hunger and starvation. There's often an emphasis on how they're treated like animals. We often see the hypocrisy of white owners. We see a quest for literacy, quest for freedom and liberty. We often see vignettes of characters that make up smaller portraits in the larger story. So we'll see an example of the happy slave, or the slave who's made an example of. And usually they'll be given names, and we'll learn a little bit about other people in the story. We'll see direct appeals to readers and a direct appeal to the audience, and this is coming off of the sort of sentimental novel tradition in England and in the US. So they'll say things like, "Oh reader, dear reader." They're directly appealing to their presumably white audience. We'll see a loss of family members and kinlessness, like we talked about last week. We'll see a lot of emphasis on Christian ethics and morality, again, in order to appeal to that audience. We often see this sort of spiritual bottoming out, sort of this despair, and then this kind of salvation, this rise and flight and redemption. And again, typically always trying to appeal to a white audience. So some of these motifs come up in every slave narrative. They're not all sort of formulaic like this, but they are kind of conventions that the writers at the time would have purposely been drawing from in order to get their story down and to shape their story into something that would have been intelligible and understandable by readers at that time. So we see that they are at once literary texts, they're historical text, they are this bottom-up history that's telling the myriad stories, right? Not the one single story, as we've been seeing this week. So let me know if you have questions, and we can keep talking about this in the forums.